the impossible biology commander Marcus. Cole had never felt so small in his entire life as he did standing in the grand hall of Axis Prime, the massive space station that served as neutral ground for the 23 star empires of the Galactic Concord. And he could feel the eyes of 1,000 alien delegates watching him with curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases open hostility. Humanity had only just earned their place here after decades of proving themselves worthy. And Marcus knew that one wrong move could undo everything his species had worked so hard to achieve. So he kept his back straight and his expression calm, even as beings 10 times his size walked past him without a second glance. The station itself was a wonder of engineering that made even the greatest human achievements look like children's toys, with corridors that stretched for miles and ceilings so high they disappeared into artificial clouds. And Marcus reminded himself that someday humanity would build something just as base. Impressive. His mission was simple enough on paper, but terrifying in practice, as he had been assigned to negotiate a trade alliance with the Velthrani sovereignty, one of the oldest and most powerful empires in the galaxy. And their ruler was the immortal Queen Sarithvan, a being who had lived for over 12,000 years and had seen countless species rise and fall. Marcus had studied everything he could about the Velthrani before this meeting, and what he learned both fascinated and worried him, because they were a proud species with skin like polished silver and eyes that glowed with an inner light. And they had once been the most numerous race in the galaxy before a terrible genetic plague struck them 3,000 years ago. Since that time, not a single Velthrani child had been born naturally, and their numbers had dwindled from trillions to mere billions, sustained only by advanced cloning technology that could copy existing Velthrani, but never create new ones. And this slow death had made them bitter and isolated from the rest of the galaxy. The Queen herself was said to be the most beautiful and most dangerous being anyone could ever meet. And Marcus tried not to think too hard about that as he was escorted into the Velthrani diplomatic chamber by guards who stood 8 feet tall and carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. When he finally saw her sitting on a throne made of crystallized starlight, Marcus understood why so many had warned him to be careful, because Queen Sarithvan was indeed beautiful in a way that made his heart ache, with silver skin that seemed to glow from within and eyes like twin violet suns. But there was also something terrifying about her, a coldness that spoke of millennia of loss and grief. "So this is what a human looks like," she said in a voice that echoed through the chamber like music. And Marcus could hear the dismissal in her tone as she looked him up and down like he was an insect that had wandered into her palace. "Your Majesty," Marcus said with a bow that he hoped was respectful enough, "I am honored to represent Earth and the Terran Union in these negotiations, and I hope we can find common ground that benefits both our peoples." The Queen's lips curved into something that might have been a smile but looked more like a predator sizing up its prey. And she rose from her throne and descended the steps toward him with a grace that made her seem to float rather than walk. "Common ground," she repeated, and there was amusement in her voice now. What could a species that has barely learned to leave its own solar system possibly offer to the Velthrani sovereignty, which has ruled 1,000 worlds since before your ancestors climbed down from the trees? Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger, but he forced himself to remain calm because he knew she was testing him, trying to see if humans were as emotional and primitive as everyone said they were. "We offer fresh perspective, Your Majesty," he replied. And sometimes the youngest eyes see things that older ones have forgotten to look for. Something flickered in the Queen's violet eyes then, something Marcus could not quite identify, and she tilted her head as if seeing him for the first time. "Interesting," she said softly. "You have courage, little human, even if you have nothing else. And for that I will grant you the honor of participating in the Velthrani bonding ritual." a ceremony we have not shared with outsiders in 1,000 years. Marcus did not know what to say, because this was not something he had prepared for. But he knew refusing would be a terrible insult. So he simply nodded and said, "I would be honored." "Your Majesty." The ritual itself seemed simple enough when the Queen's advisors explained it to him later that evening. Just a touching of hands and a sharing of breath meant to symbolize the connection between two peoples. And they assured him it was purely ceremonial with no real significance, beyond diplomatic courtesies. So Marcus stood in the sacred chamber as instructed, surrounded by Velthrani priests who chanted in a language older than human civilization. And when Queen Sarithvan approached him and placed her silver hands in his, he felt a strange warmth spread through his body. Their eyes met as she leaned close and breathed softly against his lips. And for just a moment, Marcus felt like something profound was happening, like the universe itself was shifting around them. But then the moment passed and the Queen stepped back with a satisfied nod. "It is done," she announced. And Marcus was escorted out of the chamber feeling strangely dizzy, but assuming it was just the stress of the day. 3 weeks later, Marcus was back on Earth, filing his reports and preparing for the next round of negotiations, when his communication device lit up with an incoming transmission marked as highest priority from the Velthrani sovereignty. When he answered it, he found himself staring at the face of Queen Sarithvan. But she looked different somehow. Her silver skin flushed with color and her violet eyes blazing with an emotion he had never seen in her before. Pure, undiluted rage. "You," she hissed. And her voice crackled with fury as it echoed across the light years between them. "You impregnated me, human." Marcus felt his blood run cold as the words hit him like a physical blow, and he opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out because what could anyone possibly say to that? "Do you understand what you have done?" The Queen continued, and now her voice was loud enough to make his speakers crackle. "For 3,000 years, we have been unable to conceive. And now my physicians tell me I carry a child. The first natural Velthrani conception in millennia. And the genetic signature they found is human." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Marcus standing alone in his quarters with his heart pounding and his mind racing. Because he had just become the center of the biggest scandal in galactic history, and he had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. The accusation, the news spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, carried on every communication channel and broadcast network from the core worlds to the outer rim. And within hours, the name Marcus Cole had become the most famous and most hated name in known space. Every species had an opinion about what had happened, and none of those opinions were good for humanity. As politicians and religious leaders and military commanders all demanded answers about how a primitive human had somehow violated the genetic sanctity of one of the oldest queens in the galaxy. Marcus found himself arrested by Terran authorities before he could even finish processing what had happened, and he was transported under heavy guard to Tribunal Primara, the massive judicial station where the Galactic High Court held its sessions, and where his fate would be decided by beings who had considered humans to be little more than clever animals just a few decades ago. The cell they put him in was comfortable enough by human standards, with a bed and a desk and even a window that looked out on the stars. But Marcus knew that comfort meant nothing because he was facing charges that carried the death penalty under Velthrani law, genetic assault against a sovereign. That was what they were calling it. And Marcus wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all because he had not even known what was happening during that ritual. But he could not laugh because there was nothing funny about being executed for something he did not understand. The worst part was that his own government had abandoned him almost immediately, as the Terran Council had released a statement expressing their deep regret and their commitment to cooperating fully with the investigation, which Marcus knew was political speak for We are going to let them have you because we cannot afford a war." He spent his first night in that cell staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. And he thought about his family back on Earth who must be watching the news and wondering if they would ever see him again on the second day. The representatives from other empires began arriving to add their voices to the chorus demanding his punishment. And Marcus watched through his cell's view screen as the great hall of the tribunal filled with beings from across the galaxy. The Kethmari collective sent a delegation of their insectoid diplomats, creatures with gleaming black shells and multifaceted eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not even imagine. And they clicked and buzzed their demands that humanity be expelled from the Galactic Concord. Entirely even worse were the Drath hegemony representatives, massive reptilian warriors covered in scarred green scales who had never liked humans to begin with. And their ambassador stood before the court and argued that Earth should be quarantined, cut off from the rest of the galaxy forever as punishment for this crime against nature. The humans are a contamination, the Drath ambassador declared in a voice like grinding stone. And we have always said they should never have been admitted to the Concord in the first place, because their primitive biology makes them unpredictable and dangerous. Marcus felt his hope dying with every passing hour as more and more species lined up to condemn him and his entire race. And he began to accept that he would probably not survive this, that he would be sacrificed to keep the peace. Then on the third night, everything changed when a hidden panel in his cell wall slid open and a figure in a hooded cloak stepped through. Marcus jumped to his feet, ready to fight. But the figure raised silver hands in a gesture of peace and lowered her hood to reveal herself as a Velthrani female with gentle features and worried eyes. "Please, do not be afraid," she whispered urgently. "I am High Scientist Yelani of the Royal Academy, and I have come to tell you the truth because you deserve to know it before you die." Marcus stared at her in confusion because he had expected an assassin, not a scientist offering secrets, and he asked, "What truth?" Yelani looked around nervously, as if expecting guards to burst in at any moment. Then she stepped closer and spoke in a voice so quiet Marcus had to strain to hear it. "The Queen knew," she said. And those two words hit Marcus like a hammer. She knew the ritual might work because our ancient texts spoke of a prophecy, a promise that one day a species would come to the galaxy whose biology was different from all others. A species that could bridge the gap between dying bloodlines and restore fertility to the sterile. Marcus shook his head because this could not be true. But Yelani continued before he could interrupt. "We dismissed humans when you first appeared because you seemed so primitive. But some of us studied your genetics in secret, and we found something extraordinary. Because human DNA is not like ours. It is adaptable in ways we have never seen, capable of bonding with almost any compatible species and producing viable offspring. Are you saying the Queen set this up?" Marcus demanded, and anger began to replace his confusion, because if this was true, then he was being executed for something he was tricked into doing. "She took a gamble," Yelani explained sadly. "She hoped the ritual would allow her to conceive without anyone knowing the truth. But she did not expect it to work so completely or so quickly. And when her physicians confirmed the pregnancy, she had to find someone to blame because she could not admit to her own people that she had deliberately sought out a human father for the next heir to the throne." Marcus sank down onto his bed as the weight of this revelation crushed him. And he asked the only question that mattered, "Why are you telling me this?" Yelani pressed a small data crystal into his hand and said, "Because there are some of us who believe the truth matters more than pride. And this crystal contains all the evidence you need to prove your innocence. The Queen's private communications, the research files, everything." Marcus looked at the crystal glowing softly in his palm, and he felt hope for the first time since this nightmare began. But then Yelani gripped his arm tightly, and her eyes were filled with fear. but you must understand what using this will mean. She warned him. If you expose the Queen's secret, it will destroy her reputation and tear our empire apart. Because there are factions who would use this scandal to overthrow her and plunge the sovereignty into civil war. So my choice is between my life and your empire, Marcus said bitterly. And Yelani nodded slowly. I am sorry, she whispered. I truly am. Because you seem like a decent being, and you do not deserve any of this. But I wanted you to at least have the choice. She slipped back through the hidden panel before Marcus could respond, leaving him alone with a crystal that could save his life or doom an empire. And he spent the rest of that night holding it and wondering what kind of man he really was. The revelation, the day of Marcus Cole's trial, arrived with the weight of the entire galaxy pressing down on the great hall of Tribunal Primara, and representatives from every star empire had gathered to witness what they believed would be the beginning of humanity's fall from grace. Marcus stood alone at the defendant's platform, a small human figure surrounded by towering judges from a dozen different species, and he could feel the hostility radiating from the assembled crowds like heat from a star. The data crystal Yelani had given him was hidden in his pocket, burning against his leg like a piece of stolen fire. And he had spent every moment since receiving it wrestling with the impossible choice she had laid before him. He could destroy the Queen and save himself, or he could protect her secret and accept whatever punishment the court decided to give him. And as the hours ticked by, he had come to realize that neither option felt right. The chief magistrate, an ancient being from a species so old they had no name, called the court to order with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And the trial began with a reading of the charges that made Marcus sound like the worst criminal in galactic history. Marcus Cole of Earth, the magistrate intoned, you stand accused of genetic assault against Her Majesty Queen Sereth Vane of the Velthrani sovereignty, a crime that carries the penalty of death. And you are further accused of bringing shame upon your species and violating the sacred trust of diplomatic immunity. One by one, the prosecutors presented their evidence and their arguments, painting a picture of humans as dangerous primitives who could not be trusted around civilized species. And Marcus listened to it all with a growing sense of anger and determination when it was finally his turn to speak. The hall fell silent in anticipation, because everyone wanted to hear how this small human would try to defend the indefensible Marcus. Took a deep breath and looked around at the thousands of eyes watching him, some with hatred and some with curiosity, and a few with something that might have been pity. And he made his decision. I will not use the evidence I have been given, he said, and gasps echoed through the chamber because everyone had expected him to fight for his life. I will not expose secrets that are not mine to expose, and I will not tear apart another civilization just to save myself. The Drath ambassador laughed mockingly and shouted, Then you admit your guilt, human? Marcus turned to face the massive reptile, and something in his eyes made the ambassador stop laughing. I admit nothing, Marcus said firmly, because I did nothing wrong, and neither did Queen Serethvan. And what happened between us was not a crime, but a miracle that none of us understood. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Marcus stepped forward and raised his voice so everyone could hear him clearly. You call humans primitive, he continued, and maybe you are right, because we have only been in space for a few hundred years, while some of you have ruled the stars for millions. But let me tell you what being primitive really means. He paused and let his gaze sweep across the assembled judges and diplomats and observers. It means our world tried to kill us with ice ages and volcanic eruptions and plagues and predators. And we survived because we adapted, because that is what humans do. And our DNA carries the scars of every battle we ever fought against nature itself. The hall was completely silent now, as Marcus spoke with a passion that surprised even himself. You look at our genetics and you see chaos. You see a mess of ancient adaptations and borrowed code from viruses and bacteria, and you think it makes us inferior. But what if you are wrong? What if that chaos is actually our greatest gift? He pointed toward the Velthrani delegation, where advisors sat in stony silence waiting for their queen's holographic appearance. The Velthrani have not had a natural birth in 3,000 years, and your scientists have tried everything to fix the problem, and nothing has worked. But somehow a single human managed to accomplish what all your technology could not. And instead of asking how, you are asking who to punish. Marcus shook his head, and his voice grew softer, but no less intense. I am not standing here to beg for my life. Because if my death is what it takes to keep the peace, then so be it. But I am asking you to see what really happened here. Not as a crime, but as proof of what our species could accomplish together if we stopped being afraid of each other. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the data crystal, holding it up so everyone could see it. This crystal contains the truth about what happened, he said, and I could use it to save myself, but I will not, because some things are more important than one life, and the hope of what that child could mean for the galaxy is more important than my survival. He crushed the crystal in his fist, destroying the evidence that could have freed him, and the shards fell to the floor like tears of starlight. We are the species born of chaos, Marcus declared, and our world made us strong by trying to destroy us, and we adapted. We always adapt. And that is not a weapon. It is a gift we can offer the galaxy, if you will let us. The silence that followed his words was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears then. A new light filled the chamber as a holographic projection activated, and Queen Sarithvan appeared in the center of the hall, her silver skin glowing and her violet eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression he could not read. I withdraw my accusation, she said, and her voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade. The human acted with ignorance, not malice, and his words today have shown more honor than I have seen in this court for centuries. The hall erupted in chaos as delegates shouted and argued and demanded explanations, but the queen raised her hand and silence fell again. I will not destroy the father of the first Velthrani child in 3,000 years. She continued, and I will not allow this court to punish him for giving my people hope. So let it be known across the galaxy that Marcus Cole is under my protection, and any who would harm him will answer to the Velthrani sovereignty. Marcus stared at the queen's projection and saw something new in her ancient eyes, something that looked almost like respect, and he realized that in trying to save her honor, he had earned something far more valuable. The trial was over, but Marcus understood that his story was only beginning, and the child growing in the queen's womb would change everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity. The hybrid 6 months had passed since the trial that shook the galaxy, and Marcus Cole now found himself living in a place he could never have imagined, the royal palace on Velthrani Prime, surrounded by silver-skinned servants who treated him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. Queen had insisted he remain close during her pregnancy, partly for political reasons and partly for something else that neither of them had quite figured out yet. And Marcus had accepted because he felt responsible for the child growing inside her, even if he still did not fully understand how any of it had happened. The palace itself was a wonder of crystal and light, with towers that reached toward the violet sky and gardens filled with flowers that sang when the wind touched them. And Marcus spent his days wandering its halls and trying to learn everything he could about the people who might one day call him family. His relationship with Queen Sarithvan had changed in ways that surprised them both, as the fury that had burned in her eyes during their first confrontation had slowly transformed into something more complicated, and they found themselves talking for hours about their worlds and their histories and their hopes for the future. Why did you destroy the crystal? She asked him one evening as they sat in her private garden watching the twin moons rise over the horizon. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. because exposing your secret would have caused more harm than good, and because I did not want to be free if it meant destroying everything you had built." The queen turned to look at him with those violet eyes that had once terrified him, and he saw something soft in them now, something almost vulnerable. "You are a strange creature, Marcus Cole," she said quietly, "and I am still not sure whether to call you the greatest gift or the greatest curse my people have ever received. Maybe I am both." Marcus replied with a small smile, "Because that is what humans are, a little bit of everything mixed together." The day the child was born, the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath as news of the successful delivery spread across every communication network. And Marcus stood beside the queen's bed, holding her silver hand as she cradled the tiny being that they had created together. The child was beautiful in a way that made Marcus's heart ache, with skin that shifted between silver and gold, depending on the light, and eyes that held swirling patterns of violet and deep blue. And when those eyes looked up at him, Marcus felt a love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. They named the child Saren, a name that meant bridge between worlds in the ancient Velthrani language. And scientists from both species gathered to study this miracle of genetics and possibility. What they discovered changed everything. The galaxy thought it knew about humanity. Saren was neither fully human nor fully Velthrani, but something entirely new. A hybrid that combined the best traits of both species, with the adaptability and resilience of humans and the longevity and psychic sensitivity of the Velthrani. And the researchers predicted the child would live for centuries. Human DNA is unlike anything we have ever seen. High Scientist Yolani explained to a joint assembly of Terran and Velthrani leaders. It acts as what we might call a genetic bridge, capable of stabilizing and revitalizing bloodlines that were thought to be beyond saving. The implications were staggering, because the Velthrani were not the only species facing extinction through genetic stagnation, and if human DNA could save them, it could potentially save dozens of other races as well. But not everyone was happy about this discovery. And the Drath hegemony in particular saw the growing alliance between humans and Velthrani as a threat to their dominance. Marcus was playing with Saren in the garden when the assassins came. 3 Drath warriors who had somehow infiltrated the palace using stolen security codes. And they moved with deadly precision toward the child, who represented everything they feared. There was no time to call for guards and no time to think about whether he was brave enough for what needed to be done. So Marcus simply reacted, throwing himself between the assassins and his child and fighting with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed. He was a trained soldier, but the Drath were bred for war, and within seconds they had broken through his defenses and opened wounds that spilled his blood across the garden's crystal pathways. But Marcus did not stop fighting, because Saren was behind him crying in fear, and he would die 1,000 times before he let anyone hurt that child. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a flash of silver light and the sound of Drath screams. And then there was nothing. He woke up 3 days later in a medical chamber filled with technology that hummed with energies he could not understand. And Queen Sarithvan was sitting beside his bed with exhaustion written across her silver features. "You almost died," she said softly. And there was something in her voice he had never heard before. Fear? Saren? Marcus managed to croak through a throat that felt like sandpaper. "Safe," the queen assured him. "Because of you, and because I arrived in time to deal with the assassins. Though I wish I had been faster." She reached out and took his hand, and Marcus noticed that her skin seemed slightly less luminous than before, as if some inner light had dimmed. "You saved me," he said, more statement than question. And the queen nodded slowly. "I used an ancient technique," she explained, "one that has been forbidden for millennia because of its cost. And I bonded a portion of my life force to yours to keep you from dying. Marcus stared at her in shock because he knew enough about Velthrani culture to understand what that meant. And he asked, "Why would you do that?" "Because we are not even truly together, and you barely knew me a year ago?" Queen Serethven was silent for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and pressed her silver forehead against his. "Because you threw yourself in front of assassins to save our child without a moment of hesitation," she whispered. "And because in that moment, I realized that I could not imagine a universe without you in it. I'm still not sure what that means, but I know it terrifies me more than anything has in 12,000 years." When Marcus finally left the medical chamber a week later, supported by the Queen herself as they walked through the palace corridors, they emerged into a courtyard filled with Velthrani citizens who had gathered to see the human who had nearly died defending their future. The cheers that greeted them echoed across the city, and Marcus understood that everything had changed, because he was no longer just a human who had accidentally impregnated their queen, but a hero who had proven his worth in the most primal way possible. And as he looked down at Saren, cradled safely in the arms of a nursemaid nearby, Marcus knew that this strange little family they had created was worth fighting for. The New Order 5 years had passed since the birth of Saren, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted when a single human ambassador had accidentally changed the course of history. The Terran Velthrani Accord had grown into the most powerful alliance the Galactic Concord had ever seen, with human scientists and Velthrani researchers working side by side in laboratories across 100 worlds, unlocking the secrets of genetics and adaptation. Admiral Marcus Cole, as he was now known after his promotion and formal adoption into the Velthrani royal family, stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the stars streak past as the combined fleet made its way toward Earth. The war everyone had feared for years had finally come, and the Drath-Hegemony had launched a massive invasion of human space with a fleet of 10,000 warships, determined to destroy humanity before their genetic miracle could save any more dying species. "Status report," Marcus called out, and officers from both species responded with crisp efficiency that spoke of years of training together. "All vessels accounted for." "Admiral," reported his first officer, a young Velthrani named Kale, who had specifically requested to serve under the human commander. "The Kathmari swarm ships are in formation on our left flank, and the volunteer squadrons from the reformed worlds are holding position to the rear." Marcus nodded and allowed himself a moment of pride, because this fleet represented something the galaxy had never seen before. A true coalition of species fighting together not because they had to, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. The Kathmari Collective had been the first to join the alliance after their scientists confirmed that human DNA could potentially stabilize their own failing reproduction cycles. And their massive hive ships now formed a crucial part of the defensive formation. A dozen other species had followed, some because they needed the genetic salvation humans could offer, and others simply because they believed that the old ways of isolation and suspicion had to end. Queen Serethven herself was commanding the Velthrani portion of the fleet from her own warship, and Marcus felt her presence through the bond they now shared, a connection that had only grown stronger over the years they had spent together. Their relationship had evolved from reluctant alliance to genuine partnership, and though neither of them used words like love, what existed between them was deeper than anything Marcus had ever experienced, forged in the fire of scandal and assassination attempts, and the shared wonder of raising a child unlike any the universe had ever seen. That child, Saren, was now 5 years old by Terran counting, though they aged more slowly due to their Velthrani genetics and would likely live for centuries. And they had already begun to display abilities that amazed everyone who encountered them. The scientists called it adaptive empathy, the ability to understand and communicate with any sentient being, regardless of species or language. And Marcus had watched in wonder as his child had conversations with Kethmari drones and Velthrani, elders and human children with equal ease as Aaron, was proof of what cooperation could achieve. And Marcus was willing to fight and die to protect. The future the child represented, the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system. And Marcus felt his heart clench at the sight before him. Earth hung in the distance like a blue and white jewel. But between the fleet and home lay the massed armada of the Drath hegemony, thousands of warships bristling with weapons and filled with warriors who wanted nothing more than to see humanity erased from existence. They outnumber us 3-1. Kale reported quietly, and Marcus could hear the fear beneath his officer's professional tongue. Numbers are not everything, Marcus replied, and he opened a channel to the entire fleet. All ships, this is Admiral Cole, and I know many of you are wondering why you should risk your lives to save a planet you have never seen. He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. 5 years ago, I stood in a court surrounded by beings who wanted to destroy my species. And I said something that day that I still believe with all my heart. Humanity is a gift we can offer the galaxy, because we learn to adapt and survive against impossible odds. And now we can help others do the same. The communication screens around the bridge lit up with feeds from other ships, showing crews of every species listening intently to his words. The Drath believe that strength comes from purity, from keeping bloodlines separate and species isolated. But they are wrong, because real strength comes from connection, from learning to trust beings different from ourselves. And that is what we are fighting for today. Marcus looked at the images of his diverse fleet, at Kethmari and Velthrani, and humans, and a dozen other species who had chosen to stand together, and he felt something that might have been hope. Today we show the galaxy that the old ways are dead, he declared, and today we build something new. Together, the battle that followed would be remembered in songs and stories for generations. As the Allied fleet crashed into the Drath Armada with fury and precision, Marcus commanded from the front, his flagship cutting through enemy formations while Velthrani, energy weapons, and Kethmari swarm tactics and human creativity combined into something the Drath had never seen before. Queen Serithvan fought beside him in the chaos, her warship covering his flanks whenever the Drath pressed too close. And through their bond, Marcus could feel her determination and her trust in him. The tide turned when the Drath flagship exploded under concentrated fire from 100 Allied vessels, and panic spread through the enemy fleet as their command structure collapsed by the time Earth's sun set on the battlefield. The Drath hegemony was in full retreat, their dreams of galactic dominance shattered against the strength of species they had dismissed as weak. The celebration that followed filled every world in the Alliance, as humans and Velthrani and Kethmari and all the others rejoiced in their victory and in the new era that their sacrifice had made possible. They called it the Age of Bridges, a time when species would work together instead of against each other, and humanity stood at the center of it all. No longer the primitive newcomers, but the ones who had reminded the galaxy what connection really meant on Earth. In a garden overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Marcus Cole stood with his family and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Queen Serithvan stood beside him, her silver hand intertwined with his, and Saren sat on the grass nearby, laughing at something only they could hear. Why do the other species want to be like us now? Saren asked suddenly, looking up at Marcus with those swirling eyes that held the wonder of two worlds. Marcus smiled and knelt down beside his child, thinking of everything they had been through and everything that still lay ahead, because we reminded them what they forgot. He said softly, that survival is not about being the strongest or the oldest or the purest, but about being able to change and to help others change too. Saren considered this with the seriousness that only a child could manage, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. I like that, they said, because changing together is better than staying the same alone. Marcus pulled his child into a hug and looked up at Sarah Vaughn, who was watching them with something ancient and new shining in her violet eyes. "Out of the mouths of children," she said, and there was warmth in her voice that would have been impossible 5 years ago. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear overhead, Marcus realized that this was what he had been fighting for all along. Not just survival, but the chance to build something better. Humanity had found their place among the stars, and they had done it not by conquering or dominating, but by being exactly what they were: chaotic and stubborn and impossibly adaptable, and most importantly, by never forgetting that the greatest strength of all was the ability to reach out a hand and help someone different from yourself. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be.